3, Part 1. This is about implied depth, value, and space. We're going to look at value first. We're going back to the two-dimensional image to start with, or two-dimensional artwork. And there's a lot of ways in which artists build space in a two-dimensional painting or drawing so that it feels like it's a three-dimensional space. So space, value, space, and perspective are three things that are used to imply depth. So when you're looking at a painting and then you're describing it, you always want to say implied depth or implied value or implied space. I mean, you don't have to be quite that literal, but perspective is something that only does occur in two-dimensional works, because in the three-dimensional world it already has its own perspective. You're not having to build it in. Hopefully I'll clarify that more. So artwork, we're looking at Magritte, The Treachery of Images, and this says, this is not a pipe, a very famous work by Magritte, surrealist artist in 1929. And his point here is that even though he has made it where there's highlights and shadows, which is value, and we're going to get into that, you couldn't actually put tobacco in this and smoke this pipe. It's a flat image on a board, I believe. Oh, canvas, oil on canvas, and it isn't a real pipe. So even though it seems like a kind of a lightweight surrealist work, it's very powerful in that the phrase is telling you that your mind, which is what the surrealists like to work with, dream imagery and subconscious, your mind is telling you it's a real object in terms of the physicality and the painting and so on. When we look at paintings, when we look at film even, when you think about it, movies and all kinds of imagery, we're really looking at a flat object. Like film is, or even video, is just a flat sort of film videotape. Now it's digital, so I really wouldn't be able to sort of talk about that in a great way. We haven't really pushed that too far in art history yet, in terms of our art language. But anyway, you're not really looking at the actual object, if that makes sense. You're looking at an image of that object. So he's using some perspective and value to imply depth, and he is wanting you to know that it's not really a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. Value is light and shadow, light and darkness, and it's used by artists a lot. Now remember, we went back, if you think way back to chapter 1.1, we're talking about types of line. When you're doing those contour lines, or those very soft lines that are just the outline of a shape or a quick sketch, usually don't have value. You don't put in the shadows. But when you want to show the three-dimensionality of a form, then you put in the shadows and you create chiaroscuro, which we'll get into in a second. So this particular piece, now this is confusing, and this is where it gets frustrating, I think, for students in books, because, you know, this is a photograph of a building. And yes, we're talking about both in a way. We're talking about the photograph and we're talking about the building a little bit, because it's a black and white photograph of something that has equal sort of planes, these triangles, and then there's some subsets of triangles. There's light and there's dark, and we're demonstrating this idea of value on this image. We're also sort of using the building. Like, you could have just taken, for instance, this walkway where this highlight, where this direct sunlight is, and then the shadow here. But it's interesting to think about as well here, and then we have a sphere in the book as well. So it's a little blurry here what the author's doing, but we're really just talking about the dark and light here. And if you are to use an example from the book, you cannot use something this simple. You have to use something a little more complicated when you write. So the triangular flat planes make up the whole surface, but it has a different degree of lightness or darkness, because as you saw, that you can see the direction of the sun is coming from here, or maybe a little more from here. But the sunlight usually is, you know, coming down, of course, or a lamp in a room. You can tell the direction of the light because you see there's light here and there's shadow there. The darkest darks are often right next to the lightest lights because it's in that direct shadow, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So value changes do occur gradually for the most part. we'll look at some exceptions to that. So our light source is here. So this is on a geodesic sphere. I've never taught it this way. I've always taught it on a completely rounded object that was white, even lighter than this. But when you're drawing, and this is a drawing one project, students are in a room with a light source and they draw with charcoal, usually, sometimes graphite, and they get the shadows, because there's a trick to how you make shadows look realistic, and this is what this recipe here is showing you. Okay, so this is what artists do. The brightest bright is on right here where the highlight is. Then it goes down, it gradates, light gray, medium grays, a little bit darker, and then you get into your darkest darks right here, and also this shadow from the object itself. But notice here, there's a little bit of a lighter space right here. There's a reflection from the light here, and it reflects back here. So in fact, this is not the darkest area of the whole piece, which is so interesting. So chiaroscuro is an Italian word for light and dark, and you see this beginning in the Renaissance. Caravaggio is our big number one chiaroscuro person. He really pushed it to the limit, but you'll see some other examples as well. So we're trying to make a two-dimensional artwork, a painting, mostly, drawings as well. And you have that highlight, you have the light, you have the core shadow, reflected light, and the cast shadow. Okay, so I'm going to go back one more time. This is the cast shadow, then you have the core shadow, then you have the highlight, and then you have that reflected light right there. Okay. As another example here. Now this is a very dark, again, globe. Usually it's a little bit brighter. But this highlight here, pretend this is a white ball. You can do it with a black one as well. Either way, you'll still get the same sort of recipe that the light is going to bounce off. Oops, sorry. The light is going to bounce off here the strongest, and then as you see it gradates down, core shadow, that's what that's called. That has no sun hit, or sorry, no light hitting it. Reflected light here, cast shadow. Example of chiaroscuro is Proudhon study for La Source. I don't know much about this piece other than to tell you that it's a beautiful drawing, and we really do get a sense of her three-dimensionality. There's some unfinished parts if you look down in here, and that's an interesting thing that artists do, but again, this is a study for something, so his intent is to get the figure correct and looking the way he wants it to look for his painting or a bigger work sometimes. But even look at this object here, this box, even that looks very three-dimensional, that light up there. But if you see all the light casting on the top of her shoulder, breasts, and stomach, another shoulder, that's where we know the light is coming from here, right? Then we have a bit of a core shadow there, and we have a cast shadow down there. So it's black and white chalk on a gray paper, and that's the way some assignments are done as well. If you take a drawing one class, you really enjoy it for one thing, and it's something very elemental. We all love to draw, but you'll learn a lot of these types of tricks, and you use a gray paper, and then you can go in with white chalk and highlight things, and black chalk and do the shadows. All right, so this gives us a little more of a breakdown what I was talking about. The highlight on the knee, perhaps the light. There's still some light here. Core shadow is. It's hard to follow these points, but see the core shadows right here. So a little bit lighter here. So it's your whitest whites and your darkest darks, and you'll hear drawing teachers tell you that too. You want to pop all those things, really make them more extreme than you think you should, because that's what the three-dimensionality is going to come, and that's when it's going to come out of the drawing. Caravaggio right here, The Calling of St. Matthew. Now, this is also done because the reason for using chiaroscuro, because previous to the Renaissance, a lot of stuff was kind of flat looking. The Renaissance is really about looking back toward Greek and Roman works of art, which very few paintings survived even at that time. So they didn't really know what that was like, but they knew what the sculptures were like, and they wanted to make things as lifelike as possible, and as human. The human form is what is celebrated in the Renaissance. That's one of the precepts or one of the concepts of it. Okay. At any rate, drama is another concept, or just illustrating an event. So the calling of St. Matthew, biblical story, of course they're dressed in Renaissance outfits, which is confusing, and that happens through history. But at any rate, we want to focus on this dramatic moment. So the window, the light coming through is shining, on these St. Matthew and these principal characters here. The pointing of the finger, if you remember, are lines, and also this diagonal line. Something dramatic is going to happen. So those things are at play as well. But in terms of chiaroscuro, look at his calf. I mean, that's where my eye goes. And you see how rendered that is. It's just so beautifully done, where you really think that's a meaty, strong calf that fellow has. The hands, the legs, like there's musculature, there's realness to these figures, and that is because of the chiaroscuro. Okay, so we're going to stop there.